you, do you believe this is the Word of God? Do you believe it's true? Do you believe it's historically accurate, reliable? Why?
Good question. Join Dr. Bo Kirkwood as he reviews the evidences from McDowell's book and anchors our faith in God's book. Now, Dr. Bo Kirkwood.
Today will be a continuation of our examination of the prophecies of the Old Testament as they concern Jesus Christ. Now, we will point out at the end of this lesson that there's well over 300 prophecies that directly concern the life, the death, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. These are not, obviously, these are not all the prophecies of the Old Testament. There's a lot of prophecy on the Old Testament that deal with other things besides Jesus. You add those up, it's a much bigger number than these, but this is an extraordinary number nonetheless. And again, like last week, we're going to go through these pretty quickly. Not going to dwell on each one unless we need to, but I don't think there's many that we really need to deal with. They're pretty straightforward. And then we'll look at how remarkable it would be that these prophecies could all be made and come true like they did, and the probability of all that at the end of our lesson. But we'll begin by looking at the prophecies that concern events after his burial. In other words, his resurrection, because there's quite a few. First of all, from Psalm 16, verse 10, "For you will not leave my soul in Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption." Who is this prophecy concerning? It is concerning Jesus Christ. His soul was not left in Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption. We see that in Acts 2:31, and there's multiple other passages from the New Testament that we could use to show this. So clearly, the psalmist was talking about Jesus Christ. He was talking about the Messiah. How about his ascension? "You have ascended on high," Psalm 68:18. Who was this talking about? Talking about Christ once again. In Acts 1:9, we see he was taken up and a cloud received him out of their sight. Acts 1:9. Seated on the right hand of God. Psalm, again, the psalmist says in 110 verse 1, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies a footstool." Who is this verse talking about? Again, all these are talking about Christ. Fulfillment we see in Hebrews chapter 1 verse 3. "When he had by himself purged our sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high," he again being, of course, Christ. Hebrew writers talking about. There was a lot of prophecies that were fulfilled basically in one day. The day of his crucifixion and his resurrection, all filled within about a one-day period. We know that he was betrayed by Judas Iscariot, and this was prophesied in Psalms 141 verse 9. "Even my familiar friend whom I trusted, who ate my bread, who has lifted up his heel against me." And of course, indirectly prophesying Jesus Christ, but of course referring to Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him, Matthew 10:4, and of course there's multiple other verses that we could use there as well. "He was sold for 30 pieces of silver." This was prophesied in Zechariah. "Then I said to them, if it is agreeable to you, give me my wages, if not refrain. So they weighed out for my wages 30 pieces of silver." What did Judas Iscariot get for betraying Christ? 30 pieces of silver. "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you?" This is Judas talking. And they counted out to him 30 pieces of silver. Matthew 26 verse 15. What was to be done with this money? Judas, once he received that money, didn't want it, ironically. "So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord for the potter." That's from Zechariah as well, 11:13. "Then he," being Judas, of course, "threw down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed." That's Matthew 27 verse 5. What was done with those pieces of silver? This was all prophesied, specifically prophesied. "So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw it into the house of the Lord for the potter. And they consulted together and brought with them potter's field to bury strangers in." That's what a potter's field is, apparently. That's a piece of ground where strangers would be buried, people that couldn't afford burial on their own. That's what a potter's field was, and that's what the money was used for. In fact, Matthew 27:7, once again prophesied in Zechariah. And what McDowell points out, and this is, I think, interesting, how specific these prophecies are. He says in the previous 4 prophecies, we find both prophesied and fulfilled his betrayal by a friend for 30 pieces of silver, not 29, not 31, but 29, of silver, not gold, not anything else, thrown down, not placed, in the house of the Lord, specific place where it was placed, and the money was used to buy something very specific, a potter's field. Very specific prophecy that was all fulfilled at the time of Jesus' betrayal. I think that's interesting. There's prophecy concerning being forsaken by his followers, by his disciples. In Zechariah, once again, strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. Well, we know exactly what happened at the time of the betrayal of Christ, don't we? Matthew 14, verse 50 says, they all forsook him and fled. Accused by false witnesses. Christ was certainly accused by false witnesses. Psalm 35:11, fierce witnesses rise up. They ask me things that I do not know. Then we see this fulfillment in Matthew 26, 59 and 60, and other verses. Now the chief priests, the elders, and all the council sought false witnesses against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none. They were attempting to bribe people to accuse Christ falsely. We also know that it was prophesied that Jesus would be silent before his accusers. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. That is from Isaiah 53, verse 7, which of course is a very messianic chapter in your Old Testament fulfillment. And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. We see that in Matthew 27:12 and multiple other verses as well. Wounded and bruised. Isaiah 53 once again, verse 5 this time. But he was wounded for our transgression. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. Well, what happened to Christ? He was scourged. Then he released Barnabas to them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him up to be crucified. We're going to be looking at that scourging in quite detail. I mean, that sounds like such a benign process just with that one verse. After they scourged him, like, okay, it was a very, very brutal process. People sometimes just died from the very scourging. So yes, he had many, many stripes laid upon him at the time of his scourging. And this was all prophesied once again in Isaiah 27, verse 26. He was smitten and spit upon. Isaiah, this time chapter 50, verse 6. I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who plucked out the beard. I did not hide my face from shame and spitting. Was he spat upon? Yeah, he was. Then they spat on his face and beat him, and others struck him with the palms of their hands. Matthew 26, verse 67. Of course, there could be other verses there as well. He was mocked. Was this prophesied? Well, of course it was. Wouldn't be talking about if it wasn't. Psalm 22, verse 7 and 8. And all who see me ridicule me. They shoot out the lip. They shake the head, saying, we trusted in the Lord. He's trusted in the Lord. Let him rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. You get the visual image there of what these people were doing. The shooting out of the lip, the shaking of the head. And you just kind of visually see that how they were mocking Christ at this point. And this is prophesied in Psalm 22, 7 and 8 once again. When was it fulfilled? Matthew 27, verse 29. When they had twisted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand, and they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. Any comments on any of these so far? Again, pretty straightforward prophecies, but all absolutely 100% fulfilled in Jesus Christ. How about falling on the cross? Psalms 109, verse 24 and 25, the prophecy. My knees are weak from fasting, and my flesh is feeble from lack of fatness. I also have become a reproach to them when they look at me. they shake their heads. We'll see this again in reference to another prophecy, but this we're talking about falling at the cross. And he, bearing his cross, went to a place called the place of skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha, and that's from John 19, verse 7. And then Luke 23, 26. Now as they led him away, they laid hold of a certain man, Simon a Cyrenian, who was coming from the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. Jesus, after the flogging, was so weak that he could not even carry the cross. And we see this in Luke 23, 26. Having his hands and feet pierced. This was prophesied, once again, specifically how he would be crucified. And we'll see the importance of that in just a second. But this was prophesied in Psalm 22, verse 16. And when they had come to the place called Calvary, there they crucified him. And the method of the Roman crucifixion was the piercing of the hands and feet as they put someone on a wooden cross. And McDowell points this out. Jesus was crucified in the usual Roman manner. His hands and feet were pierced by large, dull spikes that attached the body to a wooden cross or stake. He was crucified with these. Even this was prophesied. Because he poured out his soul into death, and he was numbered with the transgressors. That's again from Isaiah 53, verse 12 in this case. We know that was true from Matthew 27 and some of the other Gospels. Then the two robbers were crucified with him, and on the right hand, one on the right hand and one on the left, all again crucified hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before the fact. And McDowell points this out because I think this is a unique as well. The method of Jesus' crucifixion wasn't really known at the time of the prophecy about it. You know, Roman government wasn't in power at the time of Isaiah, was it? And so the way that the Romans crucified, they would have had no knowledge of. But the type of death pictured in Isaiah 53 and then again in Psalms 22 did not come into practice under the Jewish system until hundreds of years after the account was actually written, which makes the prophecy even, I think, more unique because they didn't, that's not the way they crucified people. They stoned them or did other things, or that's not the way they punished people during Isaiah's time. Didn't hear about crucifixion during Isaiah's time, not the way the Romans did it. He made intercession for his prosecutors. Prophecy again in Isaiah 53. And he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. You could use other verses, but the one that comes to mind is Luke 23, verse 34. Jesus on the cross. Father, forgive them. They do not know what they do. And again, you could use a lot of other verses that would also bear that prophecy as well. He was rejected by his own people. Prophesied once again in Matthew 53, this time in verse 3. He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised and we did not esteem him. That just perfectly fits what happened at the time of the persecution of Christ. And we could have, again, multiple verses, but John 7, 5 and 48. For even his brothers did not believe him. Have any of the rulers of the Pharisees believed in him? That's a general statement. Some of his Jews did believe in him, but the majority did not. And even some of his own fleshly brothers, not at the time, but they did later. He was hated without cause, prophesied in Psalm 69:4. Those who hate me without cause are more than the hairs of my head. Applied to Jesus Christ in John 15, verse 25. But this happened that the word might be fulfilled, which was written in the law, they hated me without cause. Specific fulfillment of Psalm 69, verse 4. And the New Testament tells us it was a specific fulfillment of that. Friends stood afar off. Psalm 38:11. My loved ones and my friends stand aloof from my plague, and my relatives stand afar off. Prophecy that's applied to Jesus Christ in Luke 23, verse 49. But all his acquaintances and the women who followed him from Galilee stood at a distance watching these things. In the apostles' case, A lot of them actually just more or less fled. They didn't want to be around him. And of course, we know that he was denied by Peter. And this goes back to Psalm 109, verse 25 again. Also, I have become a reproach to them. When they look at me, they shake their heads. Can you just see this visually? Just, oh, how pitiful. Just shaking their heads, basically mocking him. The fulfillment, and those who passed by blasphemed him and wagging their heads. Very specific prophecy fulfilled in Matthew 27, verse 39. He was stared upon. That was prophesied. Psalm 22, 17. I count all my bones. They look and stare at me. Fulfillment would have been Luke 23, 35. And the people stood looking on. Just watching that. Watching it, I guess, is a form of almost entertainment. His garments were parted and lots were cast. This was prophesied. Psalm 22, 18. They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Who was the psalmist talking about there? He's talking about Jesus Christ. John 19, verse 23 and 24. The soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his garments and made 4 parts, to each soldier a part, and also the tunic. Now, a tunic was without seam, woven from the top in one piece. And they said, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it. Who shall it be? So they couldn't divide that one up. So instead of tearing it apart, they just decided to cast lots, and whoever got the lot kept it. And this was all prophesied in Psalms 22 and verse 18, and came about very specifically in John 19 and other verses. He was to suffer thirst on the cross. Prophesied once again in the psalmist. And for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. After this, Jesus said, I thirst. John 19:28. Specifically, that verse says, what did they give him to drink, though? They gave him vinegar and gall. This was very specifically fulfilled in Matthew 27, verse 34. Not only that he was thirsty and that he drank, but exactly what they gave him. They gave him sour vinegar mingled with gall to drink. But when he tasted it, he would not drink. One of the many tortures of being on this cross, besides the pain that you were suffering, was apparently just a severe thirst. Severe thirst. And what did they give him? Vinegar. His forsaken cry, we know what that was. Psalm 22:1. My God, why have you forsaken me? This is from Psalm 22:1. Jesus actually said those very words in Matthew 27, verse 46. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani? That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Fulfilling Psalm 22:1. Committed himself to God. Into your hand I commit my spirit. Psalm 31, verse 5. Jesus spoke those very words as well. Luke 23, verse 46. And when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. It was prophesied even that his bones would not be broken. The typical crucifixion occurred a lot of times to hasten the death of the one being crucified. We know that they would break their bones. They would, I guess with a big mallet or something, the bones of their legs, and that would cause them then to die. Jesus didn't have that done, and it was prophesied hundreds and hundreds of years before that. Psalm 34, verse 20. He guards all his bones. Not one of them is broken. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. John 19, verse 33. Could Jesus have possibly had anything to do with that? Well, of course not. But it was prophesied long, long time before. Now, this is one that's a little bit heartbroken. McDowell literally uses the heart as the physical figure here. My heart is like wax, it melted within me. McDowell says John 19, verse 34 fulfills this. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear. Immediately blood and water came out. McDowell says that was because the heart had actually burst. Don't know if that's exactly what Psalm is talking about there, But we do know that there was evidence that he was already dead when the spear was thrust in him, because what they got out was water, blood and water, instead of what would normally happen if you were still alive and you had a spear thrust in your side. Well, the blood would come spurting out. The blood vessels the heart would still be beating, and the blood would come more like, hitting an artery. Yeah, David?
The fact that he was already dead is why the Roman soldiers did not break his bones as was customary.
Right.
Why break them if he's already dead?
That's right. And next week, if not next week, a week or two after, we're going to look at some theories, and one of them is the swoon theory. Have you heard of the swoon theory? Well, the swoon theory is that Jesus wasn't dead when he got off the cross. He was a swooning death. Not that he was faking it, but that he may have passed out, that kind of thing. But he wasn't actually dead. And so that when they put him in the grave, he was revived by the cool air in the tomb, and revived and walked away from the tomb. Of course, it's a silly theory, but there's people that believe this stuff. There's been whole books written about that. And this passage would refute that he was already... Well, that's just another thing he would have had to have done, right? Yeah, it's ridiculous. But again, books have been written, and they've been popular books. But we'll look at that. We'll look at that in detail. But that's right. One of the theories is that he wasn't even actually dead. And of course, this goes specifically where he was pierced. This is from Zechariah again. They will look on me whom they pierced. They wouldn't have pierced most people. They would have broken their bones, but they did Christ. John 19, verse 34. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear. We know that happened. Darkness over the land. What happened at the time of Christ? You remember? The earth became very, very dark during the day, not at night. This was prophesied in Amos 8 and 9. And it shall come to pass in that day, says the Lord God, that I will make the sun go down at noon, and I will darken the earth in broad daylight. And we know that happened at about the 9th hour on Matthew 27, verse 45. Now, from the 6th hour until the 9th hour, there was darkness all over the land. Some have said that was actually a solar eclipse. There's no proof that that's what it was, but how else would you explain it if you're a naturalist? I don't know if solar eclipse lasts for 3 hours, though. A full solar eclipse. I've never witnessed one, but I don't believe they last 3 hours. Yes, they don't cause total darkness either. Even where he was buried was prophesied. Isaiah 53 once again. And they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death. Joseph of Arimathea was apparently a wealthy man. We're told that. Matthew 27, verse 57 through 60, in other passages. And there came a rich man, so he was wealthy, from Arimathea, named Joseph. And he asked for the body of Jesus. Apparently he was a disciple of Christ. Wasn't an apostle, but apparently a follower. When Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in clean linen cloth and laid it in his tomb. The other thing that, by the way, on the swoon theory is he would have had to have gotten out of that linen cloth. And those linen cloths were wrapped. They were anointed, and the anointment was actually sort of making the linen cloth stick to your body. It was kind of not actually mummification quite, but very similar in some ways. And Joseph did this at his burial, which was a customary way of doing this. So what are the objections? We've given the prophecies, and we've only looked at, I didn't actually count them up, but I think we looked at about 60 or so from last week to this week. There's hundreds of more that we could look at, but I think that's enough to give you a flavor of what's going on here. But have there been objections to those prophecies? That doesn't mean a whole lot. Well, of course there have been. The skeptics have objections to everything. A lot of times they don't make a lot of sense, but they do have objections. And so one of the objections is that Jesus deliberately engineered these prophecies. He saw to it that they became fulfilled. Well, there were some things that you could say maybe that he did. Some of those things when he's talking on the cross, but man, if you're dying on the cross, are you going to be thinking about fulfilling prophecy? I mean, I just don't see that. That's not going to be on your mind to do that. Of course, in Jesus' mind, it was a supernatural mind. But that is an objection, that Jesus deliberately engineered these prophecies, made sure that they came about. And this is one of these fringe books called the Passover Plot. In fact, I think it's in the Passover Plot that we'll look at where the swoon theory is even introduced. And this is by H.J. Schonfield. And he proposed that Jesus was an innocent messianic pretender who connived to fulfill prophecy in order to substantiate his claims. That's all this is. He just went in the Old Testament, looked at all 300 and some odd prophecies and made sure that he did those things so that would substantiate his claim to be the Messiah, which got him what? Crucified. Yes. So what was that point? Unless he had a death wish when he entered, when he entered his ministry. So, but that's what the story goes. In the Passover Plot, this is an old book. It was written 20 plus years ago. But I do remember when this came out, it was a popular book. It was a best-selling book. A lot of people read this. I think they didn't want the moral obligation of being a Christian, and this was one way that they could substantiate that. But first of all, this is totally contrary to the character of Jesus, isn't it? That's not the kind of person we see if we believe the New Testament. Even secular writings about him would indicate that he seemed to be a compassionate, honest, moral person, not the kind of person that would lie or be looking for some way to substantiate his messiahship. So that's contrary to the character of Jesus. And the more important thing is, there's no way he could do these things. There's no way Jesus could have controlled many events for the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies. Many, many. He could not, for example, have picked the place of his birth. How does one do that? I don't think you could do that. Like being born of a virgin, when he would die, his lineage, we could go on and on and on and on. All the things we talked about at the time of his scourging and his death, how in the world could he have any fulfillment of that? He could not have done that. So this is ridiculous. It's so ridiculous you wonder why people would even give any credence to it. So there's no way short of being supernatural that Jesus could have manipulated the events and people in his life to respond in exactly the way necessary in order to fulfill prophecy. Would you not agree with that? Just would not. If you're honest, you will. Yes.
Maybe even the best case scenario from this perspective is someone else outside of his life, a father, an uncle, maybe somebody rich to want to influence and knew this, could have orchestrated some of it.
Some of them.
If you go that far and say that could be the way to go, you can't control darkness. Who can control that? I mean, it's just.
Yeah, you got to pay a Roman soldier to pierce his side. You couldn't do that. Impossible. Yes, David.
Yes, and notice that Jesus' harshest critics, when he performed a miracle, they could not deny. That right there to me seals the case.
Right.
Because even if your harshest critics cannot deny that a supernatural event happened, then who are people now to say that, Jesus was a fraud? That's ridiculous.
Yeah, I think it is too. Anybody else? Yes, Nate.
The most rational explanation, if he's going to voluntarily go to his death at the end of this, is, and he's also trying to contrive all this, is that he's fully deluded and believes in himself. Mm-hmm. But then that doesn't make sense. Why would he purposely try to contrive some of these things? He would expect them to just happen because he buys his own delusion. Right.
Yep. And we looked at that last week as well. Was he delusional? Or for maybe 2 weeks ago. All right. Here's another one. Jesus was these things were coincidental. They were just coincidental. They were an accident. So who can tell me there's something called the law of probability. So what person that's good in math here can basically put it real quick what the law of probability is. I'll give you the real simplistic answer. And that is likely things are likely to occur and unlikely things are unlikely to occur. That's it. That's about as simple as you get. Likely things are likely to occur, unlikely things are unlikely to occur, and very, very unlikely things are very, very unlikely to occur. That's the law of probability. I was thinking of an example, so I'm a golfer. I'm going to give you an example that shows what this law of probability is. If I have a 1-inch putt, I think there's a high probability I'm going to make that putt. Don't you think? I mean, I'm not that great a putter, but let's say if it's an inch, I think most people in this room would make that putt. Don't you think? All right, let's put it out 3 feet. The probability gets lower there. Maybe I've got a 50-50 chance of making that putt. But there's still a pretty good probability I may make that 3-foot putt. Well, let's put me at 100 feet making a downhill putt on very slick greens. The law of probability gets real low at that point. Real low. But still probable. I mean possible. It's still possible that I may sneak that putt in. Well, now put me back on that green and say, now you got to make it 100 times in a row. Now we understand the law of probability, don't we? That law of probability of anyone, Jack Nicklaus in his prime, Tiger Woods in his prime, Jordan Spieth right now, nobody going to make that putt 100 times in a row. That would be a very, very, very unlikely thing. Well, that's what these things fall into, and we're going to use a few examples. It's possible to find 1 or 2 prophecies fulfilled in the lives of men, but we mentioned 61. Very unlikely that all 61 would come together at one time. If you looked at your book, this is a very good example from Pete Stoner, and it's been used before by other men, but it's quoted by McDowell. He wrote in his manuscript, Science estimates the likelihood of Jesus fulfilling just 8 prophecies. Not 61, but 8. And he likens it to a chance in 1 in 10 to the 17th power. Need I say, that's a big number. That's a huge number. It's 1 with 1 and that many zeros behind it. 3, 6, 9, 12, whatever. 17 zeros behind it. Very, very unlikely. Very, very unlikely number. But Stoner goes a little bit further to show you how unlikely that is. He likens it to this. Take silver dollars and lay them on the face of Texas, in the space of Texas. We'd all agree that Texas is a pretty big state. Pretty big state. If you did that, these silver dollars would cover the entire state by 2 feet. Okay? Now, mark one of those silver dollars and say, go randomly pick that silver dollar out. And the chances of doing that is apparently 1 in 10 to the 17th power. How likely would that be? I think that falls in the very, very, very unlikely. And we're only talking about 8. We're talking about 8. So if you read your book, he goes even further. He goes now, how about 48 prophecies? Now, there's over 300, but now let's go to 48 prophecies. Now it becomes a ridiculous number. It was ridiculous already. 10 to the 157th power. He likens this, and I'll probably mess this up a little bit, but he likes this as, that silver dollar example that we gave. Now making an electron in the universe and finding that marked, anybody know how big an electron is? Smallest particle? Yeah, it's smaller than a silver dollar, that's for sure. He makes it equal to an electron. Finding an electron marked in the universe, 10 to the 17th power. And that's 10 to the 157th power, and that's on 48 prophecies. So very, 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 very unlikely. And if you get 300, it becomes ridiculous. It's already ridiculous. Oh, let me go back to that. All right, here's one other. Psychics predict things. They do that all the time. Psychics. Oh, yeah, I put a lot of faith in psychics, don't you? They're very good at predicting things. A test of a prophet in Deuteronomy is that the validity of a prophet and his ability to predict things will come about. Then you can say that prophet's probably from God, or could be from God if that occurred. So among hundreds of prophecies, biblical prophets are known to have not made a single error. Psychics, on the other hand, make predictions all the time, and they rarely come about. McDowell points out that in 1993, psychics missed almost every unexpected story there was. I think he refers to some psychics that predicted some things on Jay Leno and so forth in your book. But they missed the story including Michael Jordan's retirement. They missed the story about the Midwest flooding. They missed the story about the Israeli PLO peace treaty. All that took place in 1993. None of them predicted it. None of them predicted it. Among their false prophecies, I thought this was kind of funny, was the predictions of the Queen of England becoming a nun. And Kathy Lee Gifford would replace Jay Leno as the host of The Tonight Show. Well, those did not come about. Kathy Lee Gifford did not become the host, and Queen Elizabeth is still not a nun. I think it's silly and superfluous to look at psychics. That didn't happen. Real quickly, the removal of the scepter. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people. Genesis 4:9. The scepter equals the tribal staff, which furthermore equals the tribal identity of Judah. Shiloh is the name used for the Messiah. Two signs to take place soon after the advent of the Messiah: the removal of the scepter, or identity of Judah, suppression of judicial power, and this occurred during Jesus' times, as all nations were subdued by the Roman Empire and deprived of their ability to pronounce capital sentences. The scepter was therefore removed from Judah per McDowell, and the Jews knew it. Woe unto us, for the scepter has been taken from Judah, and the Messiah has not yet appeared. This is from the Talmud. This is not the Bible. They missed it, didn't they? The scepter had been removed, and the Messiah had appeared. And little did they realize that this young Nazarene was walking in their midst was the Messiah, per McDowell. The destruction of the temple. The Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. The temple had to be around for the Messiah to have gone to that temple. This verse, along with 4 others in Psalms, Daniel, Haggai, and Zechariah, demands that the Messiah come while the temple of Jerusalem was still standing. This is from Daniel. After 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off, but not for himself. The people of the prince was to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. What is this alluding to? The destruction of Jerusalem. The Messiah Messiah is cut off, dies, he did, then the destruction would occur. This prophecy was fulfilled precisely with the coming of Christ, his crucifixion, his resurrection, and then eventually the destruction of Jerusalem that occurred in 70 AD, and then the temple did fall, and it was utterly destroyed. And these prophecies occurred, all of these occurred at least 50 years beforehand. Real quickly, Floyd Hamilton in the Basis of Christianity says there's 332 distinct predictions. Those are all listed in your book. No, we're not going to look at it all, but his first advent, his forerunner, his nativity in early years, his mission in office, his passion, his resurrection, his ascension, and his second advent. I would refer to those again to see all those. They're not quoted, but the verses are quoted. So next week we're going to be looking at the resurrection, and was it real? Did it actually occur? What's the evidence of a physical resurrection of the body of Christ? And we'll probably be spending at least 3, maybe 4 weeks looking at that. I would urge you to read that chapter. Thank you.